Welcome to my new series, Forgotten. As the name implies, Forgotten is where we'll take a look at video games that have all but been abandoned, both the good and the bad ones. Now, Forgotten can be a subjective term. For me, Forgotten means that a game is relatively obscure and is shown little to no attention by its owners. In this video, we'll be looking at Sega's Ristar, released in 1995 for the Sega Genesis. Ristar is a 2D platformer, one of many in an oversaturated 90s market. While the game received high reviews, averaging about 8 out of 10, it didn't really leave a lasting impression. Couple that with the fact that Ristar released just before the 3D boom in gaming, and it's not hard to see why Ristar has become forgotten. Outside of re-releases in Sega collection games and very rare cameos, Ristar seems to be lost to time. Now, I have just a bit of a personal history with Ristar. I wasn't alive when the game first released, and I never owned a Genesis, but as a kid, I played it on the Sonic Mega Collection and Sega Genesis Collection, both on the PS2. Out of all the games in both collections, Ristar was definitely the one that grabbed me the most. However, unlike most of the Sonic games, I was never able to beat Ristar as a kid. I pretty much always got a game over on the Fire Planet, so even though I've played the game a lot, before making this video, I never saw half of what this game had to offer. It's time to change that. Let's take a look at Ristar and see if it truly deserves to be forgotten. First, let's take a look at the game's presentation. Visually, I think Ristar is stunning. I would go as far as to call this one of the best looking 2D platformers I've ever seen, especially from the 90s. Although I really wouldn't expect any less from Sonic Team. Now, as good as the art is, it does create a few minor gameplay problems that I'll touch on in a moment. The soundtrack of Ristar is also amazing. You'll be hearing Ristar music in the background of the whole video, so definitely listen close for that. The story of the game is your standard affair. An evil group is corrupting planets and Ristar has to go save them. Let's take a look at Ristar, full name PJ Ristar in case you were wondering. I think Ristar is a decent looking mascot. He was one of the prototypes that Sega came up with to be the next Mario killer that ended up being Sonic. I think the gloves and the kinda weird black body give off such a 90s vibe. It looks good in pixelated form, but kind of creepy in other styles. I think Starfy, for example, does the whole mascot thing way better for sure as far as stars go. Just based on the design alone, I could see why Ristar hasn't made a resurgence. Now on to Ristar's gimmick. You've definitely seen it in the gameplay already, but it's Ristar's stretching arms. The arms serve as your combat and most of your platforming. The arms stretch in 8 directions and have decent range. You can take damage if an enemy hits your arms, but you're invincible for a moment while throwing yourself into an enemy you've grabbed. On paper, I love this mechanic. I think it's pretty unique and could lead to some really skill-based gameplay. In practice, however, I struggled to use it. This certainly could have been caused by my own incompetence, but I personally felt that the mechanic was one of the many inconsistent aspects of Ristar. Throughout my time playing the game, I felt like there were times when my attacks just didn't work. There were a few different instances where I felt like I definitely should have grabbed an enemy, but missed. On the flip side, there were also times where I grabbed an enemy when I totally felt I shouldn't have. I'm not sure if this is because there are issues with the combat, hitboxes, or a combination of the two. Even by the time I got to the final boss, I still felt unsure of exactly what my attacks would grab and what they wouldn't grab. Speaking of hitboxes, this is one of the ways that I feel the art causes problems with the gameplay. I felt like hitboxes in the game were pretty poor. I've talked in detail about me hitting enemies, but throughout my gameplay, I felt like I got hit at times where I shouldn't have gotten hit. The sprites, as beautiful as they are, just really don't match with the hitboxes sometimes. The backgrounds and world designs in this game are amazing and really where the artwork shines. However, in a weird way, the game might look too good? To explain, I had a few different instances throughout Ristar where I had difficulties figuring out how to progress through a level. More often than not, it's because certain paths that I needed to take or certain objects I needed to interact with just kind of blended in with the rest of the world. Now, this isn't a massive issue, I only got stuck a few times, but it's just one of those little things that should have been fixed before the game released. Sometimes you'll get little indicators to help you out, but not as often as I think you should have. Now, this isn't to take away from the game's level design, which I think is really solid. Ristar is a generally slow-paced platformer, which isn't a bad thing. Each level usually has a gimmick or two and sometimes a puzzle, which keeps gameplay pretty fresh. Some levels do throw some unfair situations at you that are basically impossible to avoid taking damage unless you know they're coming, which is a negative for me. The game is fairly generous on healing items though, and you'll typically get them before or after especially challenging parts of a stage. The structure of Ristar is incredibly similar to the classic Sonic games. Each zone in the game includes 2 stages, 1 or 2 mini-bosses, and a zone boss. There are only 6 zones, so the game is pretty short if you can complete it without getting a game over. The game took me about 4 hours in total, but if I went back to do a second playthrough, I think I could beat it in about half the time. Full disclosure here, I played this game on the Sega Classics Virtual Console on Steam, meaning I had access to save states, which I did use throughout. Even with save states, I did end up getting a game over on the game's final planet. To be honest, I didn't realize I had limited continues when I was playing, even though it's pretty obvious on the continue screen, so I was playing pretty recklessly. If I had realized there were limited continues, I may have played the game a bit more safely throughout, and maybe would have reached the final boss before I had a game over. Speaking of game overs, let's talk about the game's difficulty. I think a blind playthrough of this game is honestly pretty tough. I touched on it before, but this game has a decent amount of unfair moments throughout levels and even boss fights. The game's difficulty curve definitely peaks in some places, and then kind of ends up mellowing out at other places. For example, the jump between the second zone, the water planet, and the third zone, the fire planet, is really steep. The first 2 zones are pretty much a cakewalk, but that fire planet can sap a lot of lives from you. The 4th zone, the sound planet, is about as tough as the 3rd zone, and then the 5th zone, the ice planet, is as easy as the first 2 zones. The 6th zone, the mechanical planet, is probably just somewhere in the middle. Not too easy, but not too hard. Just like the game as a whole, a majority of the bosses can be tough when you first face them. After a couple deaths and learning their patterns, the bosses usually become very easy to beat. Depending on the boss as well, you can brute force your way through and tank hits while constantly hitting them. They'll just die before you do. I think that's a pretty good overview of Ristar. Now let's take a bit of a deep dive into each zone to really see what Ristar has to offer. Ristar's first planet is Flora, and it's your standard green hill zone type of experience. The first 2 stages are easy and give you a good opportunity to grasp most of the platforming elements of the game. You are also introduced to the concept that each stage has hidden areas and special bonuses hidden behind some more complex platforming challenges. As I said before, it's a very standard Sonic Team platforming experience and feels a whole lot like Green Hill Zone. It serves its purpose well enough, even if I felt it fell a little short of its potential. There was a short section of level 2 where the entire screen would become dark as you traversed through the level. It lasts all of about 30 seconds, but I felt the level could have used it throughout. Flora's mini-boss and final boss were incredibly easy and hardly worth mentioning. Before we move on, I do want to say Flora's design and color palette are absolutely beautiful. The many shades of green mixed with purples and blues are just so pleasing to look at. It is definitely one of my favorite 2D level designs visually. Next was Planet Undertow, the water planet. As you would expect, there is a lot of swimming in this level, but it's really not all that bad. Usually I hate water levels, but Undertow is pretty easy. Swimming is clunky, but it's a 2D platformer, so that's almost inevitable. Both stages are fairly standard. Stage 2 has some bubble platforming that I spent way too much time trying to pull off when it really wasn't necessary to complete the level. I did manage to reach my first bonus stage in this world, and it was a fun timed challenge. Undertow's final boss was also a cakewalk, and just like that, I finished the first 2 planets in under 20 minutes. Undertow had some really good music, and I loved the water effects changing the background as you swam around. So far in, I was coasting through Ristar. I was wondering how I struggled so much with this game as a child, at least until I hit the 3rd planet, Planet Scorch. This planet is where Ristar's difficulty suddenly spikes. In the game's first 2 planets, you really don't have to deal with traps very much, and when there are traps, they're easy to avoid. That is not the case in Scorch. Scorch's level design is really reliant on traps, and many of them are not easy to get through. This Vulture section took me a whole continue, or 5 lives, to finally get through. And this certain puzzle, where you had to attack enemies in a certain order multiple times, took me 2 continues to get through, and those are both on stage 1 of Scorch. For comparison, I don't think I used a single continue throughout planets 1 and 2. Thankfully, stage 2 of Scorch was not nearly as bad. Scorch's final boss was also the first boss that I really struggled with. Unlike the last 2 bosses, you aren't necessarily supposed to be full on aggressive. There are also sections of the fight where you are falling and your aim has to be perfect or you're taking damage for sure. I've already talked about my difficulties when trying to aim my attacks, so this really was a struggle. Nonetheless, I did manage to beat the boss after only a few deaths. Scorch stands out visually with its fire effects constantly reflecting off the foreground of the stage. It's a really nice effect. Planet Sonata is the 4th planet and definitely the weakest planet in every area. The gameplay gimmick of the first level is that you have to carry a metronome throughout while enemies try to take it from you. It's such a slow, boring level with no redeeming qualities at all. The music sucks, the art design is nothing special. It really felt out of place for this game so far. Level 2 isn't much better. It's another slow level where you often have to wait for enemies to let you pass, and even that's hard to time. Level 2's music also isn't good, and the art design is just boring. The final boss fight isn't anything special. I had less trouble with it than Scorch's boss, but at least it has a few cool visual effects. Planet Freon is the game's ice planet, and now seems like a good time to mention that the game's settings aren't very unique. I would have hoped to see a bit more originality in the planet concepts as opposed to just forest, water, ice, and fire. At least Planet Sonata was unique for the time despite its shortcomings. Anyway, back to Freon. It's really easy for some reason. The stage 1 gimmick is that you slide around on ice. Easy enough. The stage 2 gimmick brings us back to swimming, and it's just as easy as the water planet's levels. I really felt like Freon should have been the 3rd planet in the game, and not the 5th, purely from a difficulty standpoint. I did struggle a little bit with Freon's final boss. The entire fight is reliant on throwing an item at the boss, but I just couldn't get the timing down until after a few deaths. Freon's music stands out as being really good, but the general art design wasn't very impressive. The 6th and final planet is Automaton, which has a robotic theme. Stage 1 of Automaton has both my favorite and least favorite gimmicks in the entire game. The gimmick that I really liked was at the beginning of the stage. It consists of bars that appear and disappear as you swing around them. I thought this was a great way to test your platforming skills without having to be reliant on any enemies being around. My least favorite gimmick was the swimming or floating section of the stage. I found this section to be really annoying because of the enemies in the area, and it just wasn't clear where you would swim and where you wouldn't swim. This is also where I had trouble figuring out where I was supposed to progress through the level. I just felt like the game didn't really give you enough clues on what the correct direction to go was. Stage 2 was one of Ristar's more unique levels as it involved teleportation, manipulating platforms to your advantage, a few different swinging challenges, interaction with the background, and a bunch of tough enemies. The sheer variety of Stage 2 made it the game's best level in my opinion. Automaton's final boss was easy and hardly worth mentioning. The music and art of this planet was just kinda mediocre overall. After Automaton, you're sent to a mini stage with just a couple platforming challenges before another boss fight. This boss is pretty tough. It has a lot of different attacks that come at you very fast. After a few deaths, I realized that brute force was the way to beat this boss rather than trying to dodge everything they threw at me. After defeating this boss, you are taken to the lair of the final boss, Kaiser Greedy. Before we even talk about the fight itself, I need to gush about the art and music here. First of all, this arena is absolutely beautiful. All of the glistening in the background, the different colors that go together perfectly, and the backdrop of space behind you just works so well. And the final boss music you're hearing right now is also just amazing. The tempo switch during the fight just makes everything feel so much more tense. I have to consider it one of my favorite video game tracks of all time. Now the fight itself is no joke. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that it took me around 30 minutes to beat this boss. I'm really not sure how many playthroughs it would have taken for me to beat this game without save states, purely because of this final boss. Like all the other bosses though, you really just have to learn attack patterns and how to dodge those attacks. With some perseverance, I did manage to beat the final boss and the game itself. And that's all there is to Ristar. Ristar also got a Game Gear game that's really just a condensed version of the main Genesis game. It has a few different levels and bosses, but it doesn't really compare to the Genesis game in my opinion. Now, does Ristar deserve to be forgotten? You may have guessed by now, but I'm going to say no. I think there's a lot of missed potential with Ristar. Had Ristar got the amount of attention in sequels that, say, Sonic got, I think it could have been among the best platformer series ever. Thankfully, not all hope is lost for Ristar. It is soon releasing on Nintendo Switch with the Sega Genesis Collection, and is available with the Nintendo Online Expansion Pack. It's a very slim chance, but with the resurgence of retro games and companies attempting to capitalize on nostalgia, maybe we'll receive the long-awaited Ristar sequel. For now though, if you're a fan of 2D platformers, I would highly recommend you give this game a shot. Let me know in the comments if Ristar deserves to be forgotten. If you have any obscure games you'd like to see on the series, make sure to let me know that as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video where we'll be taking a look at a forgotten Sega fighter. See you next time.